What is something called the illusion of control? It's something which has been studied now for around about 40 years under this heading of illusion of control. And in essence, it's captured with this idea that essentially we often act as though we can control events which are effectively random. Again, I kind of cover myself by saying, well, random in inverted commas, things that either appear to be random or are genuinely chance determined. And one of the researchers, a researcher called Ellen Langer, as part of her PhD research back in the 1970s, she effectively coined this term and did a series of really neat experiments that seemed to illustrate this illusion of control. One of them was quite a nice one where she asked people to take part in a lottery that she was running. Some of the people taking part could choose their tickets, but again it was essentially random. They put their hand into a bag and would pull out their ticket, so they weren't seeing what the ticket was, but they were allowed to choose. They were given the act of doing something to choose their ticket, whereas another half, the other participants, were simply allocated a ticket. They were given a ticket. So it's still purely random, but one half given the act of choosing, one half not choosing. And then at a later point, she would go back to those people and say, if you were to sell on your ticket, how much would you sell it on for? And the people who had been given the opportunity to choose their tickets, surprise, surprise, would sell on their ticket for a much higher price. And she would argue that suggested they were acting as though they were exhibiting some kind of skill in choosing their ticket. It was therefore either worth more in general or at least more valuable to them. And she's got a series of these nice experiments that she would argue illustrates this kind of illusion of control. And a number of researchers since then doing more research of a similar nature. So that's a big part of it. The second part is essentially we are all susceptible to this bias. So again, a large part of psychological research is that how do we discover the ways in which we often aren't very good at interpreting or seeing the world around us. For psychologists are good at studying illusions and where we make mistakes. And what she was arguing is essentially it's not something that you are suffering from a problem if you perceive this illusion of control. It's a natural bias. We are all susceptible to it to some extent. And in a moment we'll talk a bit more about perhaps there's some differences between us, but that's the key point at this stage. There's also been writings about it saying, well, yes, it's an illusion, because often we do act as though we can control events over which we have no control. Another good example, back again from research on dice players, some great stuff in terms of when you're rolling dice, either first of all watching gamblers who would blow on the dice, as though that would have some impact, and again that would be an example of an illusion of control. Or another one, which is quite a nice, more subtle one, is if dice players want to get a higher number, you throw the dice harder, whereas a lower number, you throw them more gently. In theory, if it's a random process, it doesn't make a big difference.
Is that why my son throws the dice across the room when we play Monopoly then?
I'm sure maybe. You're exerting more control, you perceive you're acting as though. So these little examples of how we often act as though we have control. But research since then has suggested that, well, yes, there's an illusion. There may be some argument that it's a positive illusion, though. It can be helpful to us to perceive, though, we have some control over events over which we maybe have little or no control. And it can be helpful even if in terms of it's just our own well-being. By perceiving as though things aren't purely random, that we have no control over anything, by perceiving as though we do have control, it's helpful to us. So it's described as a positive illusion because that has, and this is a term that psychology uses, adaptive value, i.e. it can be helpful to us. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. However, and this is where I'm now kind of adding to this. This is where we're now in the realms of some degree of speculation here. This is why we're taking part in research to see if this is something that impacts upon our experiences. Perhaps an important part of it, though, is about accepting it that it is an illusion. And as I read that statement, I'm reminded of a phrase which is typically attributed to Albert Einstein, talking about reality, which says that reality is an illusion, albeit a very pervasive one. Now, we're not going to get into the discussion of physics and whether or not reality is an illusion or not, but here we could argue at least the illusion of control is an illusion, albeit a very pervasive one. It's something that we almost recognise that, yes, I'm going to be susceptible to perceiving control even if, in fact, I don't have control. Now, that could be an important first step, just accepting that it is an illusion. We often act as though we have control, in fact we don't. And then, this is the key part, related to this idea of accepting that which we cannot control. So that's what it's about. It's about recognising that you are going to be, and maybe part of this process is over the next couple of weeks at least, and perhaps beyond, is noticing, are there events, times when you're acting in a way where you think, actually, am I acting in a way where I'm perceiving control when in fact I don't have any? Am I exhibiting illusion of control? Recognising, oh, we're all prone to this, so I don't berate myself for it, but I accept it's an illusion, and then off the back of that, recognising there are things here that I cannot control, and accept that I'm possibly not in control here. Is that okay? So accepting it's an illusion, accepting that which we cannot control. So, and it's going to be a challenge. I'm not saying this is going to be easy stuff, but given this is a natural bias that we have. The second part of it is something called locus of control. Now, locus of control, some of the research on this dates back even further than some of the 1960s, but it's still ongoing. And locus of control effectively argues that whilst illusion of control may well be an underlying bias we all possess, there are individual differences. So across individual people, we tend to differ in terms of the extent to which we see ourselves as influencing the events that happen to us. So it's a different line of research, but it's touching upon the same kind of issues. And part of that was saying there are ways in which you can identify how much people perceive themselves to be largely in control of what happens versus how much they see themselves as not being in control. So locus of control regarding to where you perceive control to be. Is it within you or is it outside of you? And on that basis, you might be able to be categorised or score more highly in terms of internal locus of control. So if you largely see yourself as being responsible for what happens to you, but it's down to things that you do, then you would be regarded as having more of an internal locus of control. And then the flip side of that would be if you tend to see others, so it could be powerful others, it could be employers, it could be the government, it could be anything that you see as outside of you, or chance, things there's no clear description of what's causing these things, but it's something outside of you, then you would be perceived to have an external locus of control. And there are a number of measures that have been generated over the years to help define that. I'm not going to ask you as part of this to complete one of those. I'm toying with the idea of whether or not I will put one on Blackboard. So maybe you will see one appear there. So if you're watching this online, there may well be a link below this where the more I say these things, convince myself I probably will do that, to give you an idea of how these things are measured. But it's not something I'm asking you have to complete. You might initially just reflect on your own feeling of, because these measures essentially ask you to agree or disagree with different statements, and in the end you could probably feel as though, well, yeah, I'm probably tend to perceive myself as being largely in control of what the things that happen to me, or you more feel as though there's something outside your control. So you'll be one or the other, or be biased more one way or the other. Okay with that so far? And then the key question becomes, which is it better to be? Is there a preference to be more internal in your locus of control, or a preference to be more external? I'm not saying there's a correct answer here. In terms of, again, psychological research over the years, there seems to be at least some evidence in some situations that an internal locus of control, again, is more helpful. So you're thinking, hold on a minute, a minute ago he said that an illusion of control, perceiving often we have control and we don't, is something we need to accept as being an illusion. However, in some situations you may find that perceiving that you do have some control over what happens to you, again, is adaptive, is helpful to you. and particularly in the context of health-related behaviours. That's where it's been researched quite a lot. So people who are more internal in the locus of control are, perhaps not surprisingly, more likely to engage in behaviours which are health-promoting. They're more likely to be careful about what they eat, moderate what they eat, take part in exercise, do things which are supposedly helpful for their health, and maybe avoid or do less of those things which are less good for their health. So it makes sense there that in that context, an internal locus of control can be helpful. But again, this is something which I'm willing to challenge a little bit in the context of at least this study. Perhaps, and particularly in the context of luck, or things that we perceive as luck, it's actually getting that balance right. It's accepting the things that we can control, accepting things that we can't control, and doing something about the things that we can control. So maybe it's not about being overly internal and seeing everything as being down to us, that we're responsible for everything that happens to us. That isn't the case. There are things over which we have no control, and it's recognising and accepting those things. So if you see yourself as being more one than the other, an encouragement to become, is there ways of recognising that and becoming more balanced? Is that okay with that in terms of locus of control, thinking where you might be on your own internal or external locus of control? And this is another quote which I think I can read out to you now. And it's a bit dated, it's from the 1970s, but it captures some of the ideas we're interested in. And it says, "The world is simple. There are paths in the universe, a natural flow that makes my choice simple and obvious. I discover these natural paths when I am open and receptive, when I sense what is inside and what is outside my body." And it comes from a book called Profound Simplicity. And it relates to some of the kind of thinking at that time, which means slightly more alternative approaches to life. But I think there is still this idea within it, which is important for what we're talking about today. And one part of it, I would say, is this idea, perhaps recognising, or if it's something one finds harder to recognise, but allowing oneself to believe, perhaps even for the context of this study, there is indeed a natural flow to what goes on around you, that once you're able to recognise it, identify it, then it should make choices simple and obvious. Again, there's some of this that could be quite challenging. And those times at which you recognise what those paths might be is when you're open and receptive, sense what is inside and what is outside my body. What I can do something to control and what is outside of me. And to me, even though it's not a word that's explicit in there, it's recognising the harmony between how I can interact with my environment in a harmonious way, and that's what I'm capturing, this idea of going with the flow. Recognising there is perhaps this natural flow, and this is something we can explore and comment on. You might come back to me and say, no, I don't see any of this going on around me. Is there still some elements of these exercises which should help us to recognise that? And so with that in mind, I would like to take a few moments to, because I would say part of what gets us to this state of mind are some of those mindfulness approaches. So the resources, again, I encourage you to look at over the next week or two, as much as you reasonably can, that works for you. The one I'd like to take a moment to listen to now, it's a few minutes long, it's about 4.5 minutes, and it's not necessarily a mindfulness exercise, but it is a reminder. It's a reminder of, to allow ourselves to be accepting of things, and I think it does sit in quite nicely with what we're talking about today.